Hello, and welcome to Property Matters, a weekly look at all matters property designed to be of interest to anyone who has an interest in property. And Property Matters is supported by Fairview International Property Consultancy and Town and Country Property Auctions London. Each week we focus on those big property stories of the week, and we'd love you to get involved with us live on the show, so don't be shy. Put your comments in the comments section below wherever you're watching us today on Facebook or YouTube, and of course get involved in the show. And if you'd like to email us, propertymatterstv@gmail.com is the email address. Joining us as always for Property Matters is our property specialist. It's Joe Joshi. Welcome, Joe. How are you feeling?
Good morning, Paul. Yeah, it's a challenge, I'm afraid, at the moment with this COVID. Most part of it's up, but as you can see from my coughing in and whatever, it still sits on the chest. And I didn't actually, I suppose, give it the credit it has been getting on national coverage, that how bad COVID can be, and it seems to be lingering. But fingers crossed. But then our job is to talk, you see, Paul. So we can't rest that throat and that chest, so forth. So here we are, doing what we do best: chat.
Absolutely right. And there's plenty to talk about this week, as always. It's been a busy week, should I say, in Parliament, because the leasehold reform bill has been going through the Commons. This is basically the following the report from Property Mark, which was talking about just how outrageous some of the leasehold arrangements, particularly on new builds. I'll just put some perspective on this, Joe, before we get into the meat of it. But in 2018, Property Mark did some research, and they found that 62% of respondents felt that they were missold their leased property. 93% wouldn't purchase another one. And they now find themselves with escalating ground rent, extortionate fees for making cosmetic alterations, even down to things like changing the front door. And as a result, of course, when people do their property searches, they find all this out and they don't want to buy, so they're unable to sell. 78% of leasehold owners bought their home directly from the developer rather than going through an estate agent. And then, of course, what happens is, guess what? They say, we'll use our recommended solicitor. So the property developer's solicitor gets involved, and it turns out that half of those people haven't been told about these arrangements. So there's some pretty shocking stories in here, Joe, of what's been going on. And freeholders, for example, being charged £1,400 to inquire about installing double glazing, £887 to change the kitchen units, £689 to replace the flooring, and some even faced charges just for changing the blinds, and they wanted £526 for that. And a new front door would cost you a consultation fee of £410. So there's no doubt about it that the system needs changing, but this wasn't what leasehold was meant for, was it, Joe?
Absolutely, it's very shocking news, to be honest with you. And I suppose being in the business as long as I have, in the older times, they were not as onerous leases as these new ones seems to be. There was obviously things to talk about. For example, every time somebody wanted to have an update of ground rents and service charges, the landlord or the landlord's agents will charge administration costs. And that was probably grieving enough to say that you have to now pay again for something that, but I get that, because if somebody hasn't looked after all of their invoices and documents and so forth, and someone else has got to do that work, they can charge. But these new properties that were sold with these onerous leaseholds is really a shame on the builders and the developers that felt that they could actually hold ransom potential people that have actually done the courtesy of buying their properties. So there's no question in my mind that the reform has to be looked at, and I'm pretty certain we'll have a success. Our regular contributor to this, Guy Charrison, is an expert on the leasehold side of it, and it'll be good to have Guy's input at some stage about his thoughts as far as the reform is concerned. But I think definitely that the government has the right to do that. Property Mark search has shown a good thing on that. And of course, it does for agents make it extremely difficult to sell properties that are, of course, such onerous leases. And I certainly wouldn't want to, and I certainly wouldn't want my children to be involved in such things. And I'm sure that is the case across the board. A lot of people must feel that way. And that it really puts the complete kibosh on what's, the whole thing about a, a nation to, or a generation to buy as opposed to a generation to rent. But we are not renting these properties. These are people that have bought flats in development, major new developments that have got these leases on them that have now actually been quite onerous. And of course, leases are very, very detailed. And it is important for everyone to make sure and get the right legal advice and to get the right legal lawyers teams on there to make sure that they fully understand exactly what they're signing to in this particular case. And the problem is, Paul, what happens when you're buying a property, the enthusiasm is about buying the property. That's where the problem comes.
Mm.
So, you've got this dream, you walked into this nice apartment, and you begin to put your bag in, you begin to hang your dressing gown on the back of the door in the bathroom. You've got the whole story in your mind that I'm going to live here. This is my home, and I love it. And all the legalities and all the bits that are involved in it kind of go out the window. This becomes an emotional buy. So, and if somebody tells you at that stage you can't do this or you can't have it, you kind of always feel to say, "Oh, it's all right, don't worry, we'll just take it on anyway, and we'll get on with it." And I remember that same scenario back in the days when when we first started in this business. Mortgages was not a question. It was a case of how much and how quickly and what do I have to do it. And that exactly is the situation still continues in home buyers' minds. That basically, I want this, I've seen it, I like the feel of it. What do I do? Where do I sign to actually have it? And whilst they do all of that with all the emotion, what happens is that someone else is taking extracting the Michael, as one would say, in a nice possible way, because they know that the people that are buying these properties are buying them in emotion as opposed to perhaps being logistical about it and legal about it. And that's where these things fall in. And I just think that it's a shame on the developers that feel that they can actually do that slightly underhanded. And of course, also perhaps those legal advisors that have been brought in specifically to advise on doing such detailed, technical, hidden points in a long lease, and equally for the buyers whose whose solicitors are not able to perhaps pick it up. Law is an ass, as they say, and of course, some people are good at extracting the details out of these things, and some people are not. So it is about specifics as far as that's concerned. But yes, I'm really glad to hear that there is a reform going on, and I'm pretty certain it's going to get a lot of support.
Yes, well, Guy has come in and responded to us straight away. Bless him. Thank you, Guy. Leasehold reform for houses has really come about because of developers being unreasonable. And I would add buyers' lawyers often recommended by the developer not advising the buyers of the onerous terms. And that's absolutely right, because I have the stats here for Guy's benefit. When it came to completing the purchase, says Property Mark, 65% used the solicitor that their house builder recommended. So that's 2/3. And then who failed to tell 15% of them that they weren't even buying a freehold. So 15% of those purchasers didn't even get informed that they weren't buying a freehold, that they were actually buying a leasehold. As a result, 2/3 feel like they were missold, while the majority, 94%, regret buying a leasehold. And as a result of that, 31% are struggling to attract a buyer now, and 25% of them have had interest from a house hunter, but they've walked away as soon as they've seen the lease. It's pretty damning, isn't it? But I suppose that the main thing is that you really have to read the small print and ask every question of your lawyer. But you would expect that there's a claim there for mis-selling, I would have thought.
Oh, undoubtedly. I mean, the new set of lawyers for mis-selling are probably rubbing their hands in glee and sort of saying, right, well, this is another one that we can actually go out there and start telling everybody we're going to get them their money back and so forth. But that's not what this is about, really, Paul. It's quite a shame that when someone is in that emotional purchase position and decide that they want to have their home, which is what the whole thing about the UK is. It's a big thing about buying your own property, owning your own home, and the wish and the want to achieve the goals that you want to do. And then there are these people that are sitting in there in hidden situations. And yes, absolutely, Guy's right. You know, they give solicitors and people that are part of their team. And like I said, in my sort of feedback on that is that people tend to turn around and say, I want this. I've decided, you know, where my dressing gown is going to go. And if that's what I've got to do, if I've got to use your lawyers, I've got to use your finance people, I've got to use this, I've got to do that. If that's what I've got to do to purchase this property because I've now put my heart, you know, in this home and decided this is what I want, and my partner, and you know, however that emotion gets it, that's where they get them, and that's a very sad thing. And so obviously, our program, Property Matters, is designed for people to understand this in sort of layman's term, and that's what we're trying to say that, you know, always take the right advice, take the guidance, take stock of what's going on, and you know, listen to the lawyers that you have. I have to say, as my little own caveat, not every lawyer has got the same view on these things, but you will get an opinion and take heed of the advice that's given to you.
Yeah, as a result, 1 in 5 or 18% have actively tried to then buy the freehold to make their property more attractive for sale, and 41% further are thinking about doing so, which probably wouldn't be a bad idea. But the government now, in 2018, they consulted and they suggested for this bill that it should be capped at £10 a year, but the actual bill stipulates an annual rate of 1 peppercorn. Are you able to explain a bit more about what that is, Joe?
Peppercorn is basically, it's like £1 or 1 penny or anything like that. It's just something
gesture.
that they've got to. Yeah, it's a gesture that they've got to do. I suppose if I sort of give it to you in my understanding as layman's term, a actual exchange of contract can be done on 1 English pound note as it was, but it would be pound coin now. And but it really doesn't have a particular strength and a value. So a 10% amount is actually given, so to show goodwilling and of course a little bit of pain to make sure that the person understands that this is a serious commitment. And I think this is what happens on these rents. But the problem with peppercorn is on mostly where they've virtually sold what they call the freehold. So 999 years or much, much longer, a couple of 250 years, and they then have a peppercorn, because to be honest with you, there's nothing else to collect from anybody, but it just goes to show the difference between the leasehold and the freeholder, and someone still owns the freehold. And a lot of those old freeholds that had such things as peppercorns, majority of them people have been trying to buy off of those landlords between the leaseholders themselves. So they form a company perhaps, or a separate entity of which they tend to have a share going forward, and then have the share of the freehold, and they can always sell that share on as they sell the property on, and that actually is a much nicer, much cleaner way to deal with it. So peppercorn is very much on the long term, and because these leases have been either 99 years or 125 years, developers that have done those have obviously put in the opportunity to take as much ground rent as they can. So they start them at a certain price. For example, it might be £250 a year, and then every 5 years or 10 years it is escalating to an astronomical amount, where it can end up saying, you know, £1,000, £1,500 a year that they're just paying for the ground rent privilege. And that then puts a good book value on that portfolio of properties, and that's where they do. So then eventually the freeholder will sell that book somewhere, and somebody else will buy that and think, you know, that. So not often we find that insurance companies tend to buy things like that, because they know that this is like a drip process, regular money coming in from people that are in there. And it also gives the insurance company the potential of new clients, because obviously those clients will need other insurance products, and so they'll look at those things. So that's the peppercorn side. Hopefully that's pretty clear there.
Guys added, flats and maisonettes are a different story. The change will ultimately not be so bad for the freeholders. Put simply, the freeholder is supposed to get a return on the premium. This is based on a rate of around 5%. Well, you can't get a return to 5% safely. So this could change and push premiums up. He also says a peppercorn can be demanded, not necessarily a pound. So, put simply, a freeholder is supposed to get the return on the premium. Yeah, I mean, the thing about this, Joe, is that regardless of whether, this is what the government is saying, regardless of whether the ground rent is a nominal peppercorn or £1,000, the fundamental issue is that no meaningful service is provided in return.
Absolutely, there isn't. I mean, once they've sold the long leasehold, they really got nothing else to do other than to sit there and collect that peppercorn. As Guy says, they can demand it, or even the ground rent. And on top of that, it's not just those things; it's the service charges that they then charge, or the administration on the service charges of maintaining perhaps the general communal areas that they've got to do. And all of those become quite expensive. And certainly of the last 15, 20 years, those apartments that have been sold in blocks, especially in London, had astronomical costs. And it's interesting to see, because that then sort of brings you onto the other thing, which is the claddings on these properties. And those costs and charges have all of a sudden, not included or not insured adequately buildings, which now the leaseholders are having to foot the bill to sort out all the cladding side of it. So the leases are somewhat onerous and they do need to look at it. And as I said right at the outset, our expert residential contributor, Mr. Guy Charrison, is the man for the job. So anybody that has any issues with that, Guy's the man to be talking to.
He said you could actually say a rose petal or anything else as opposed to a peppercorn. Perhaps 10 years ago you could have put a Bitcoin on it. That would have been an interesting issue now. Absolutely right. Basically what the government are saying is they're legislating so that new residential long leases will have no financial demand for ground rent. Instead, nothing more than an actual peppercorn can be collected from the leaseholder. So they're actually suggesting it doesn't even need to be an actual piece of currency. Anyone buying a new property now also has the reassurance that developers can only change a peppercorn rent on all new leasehold properties, which is can only charge a peppercorn rent, which is effectively zero. The same applies to anyone extending their lease under a statutory route, in that they will be able to reduce the amount they pay to next to nothing. This is currently subject to a 2-year ownership provision. So you've got to have owned the property for 2 years and then you can change it. Whether that onerous condition stays put through the parliamentary reforms remains to be seen. The government now needs to go a step further and introduce nothing more than a peppercorn leasehold rent for all existing leaseholds. And this is the important thing about this bill so far. And this is where I hope and I pray that there'll be a change, because the fact of the matter is this is only for new build properties, Joe. So those of us that are already in purchase properties, this will not help them.
No, and I'm sure there will be. Well, I think what will happen primarily is that it will give the stepping stone for the legal teams to actually use the new bill, if it's successful, in order to be able to fight some of the issues that will be. So at some stage, some landmark ruling will come through, some litigation, which will allow them to then go back and attack the older leases and so forth. So beware that will happen. It happens often in these situations, and of course they can't deal with things that have gone by, but certainly they can only deal with going forward. But the legal system is such that at some stage there will be success, and when that success happens, they will use that success to open the doors for all of the backlogs and the mis-selling and so forth that will come through. So let's see what the bill comes through with, but I'm certainly rooting for the leaseholders on this.
Well, absolutely. And why we're discussing it this week is because it got its second reading in the House this week. It went through unopposed for the second reading. So it's now gone on to the Public Bill Committee, which will scrutinise it and report back by the 9th of December. And then there'll be a third reading in the House of Commons before the bill goes to the final stages where amendments will be considered. And then it gets its royal assent. So it looks as if it's going through unopposed, but I'm sure there'll be some discussion around whether they could retrospectively give people the right to challenge what they've bought in recent years. Maybe How would they do that, Joe? Do you think would they say, right, if you bought something in the last 15, 20 years, I suppose it depends on when this sort of practice started. I mean, the other fact of the matter is that leasehold agreements were never there to stop people changing the flooring or the curtains, for example, was it?
No, and and they may not be able to put a time span on it. They may just have to say that over the last 50 years or whatever, because it is difficult to actually define whether it was over 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and they've all been changing. But I'm pretty certain that everybody will get a window of opportunity to make their challenges in order to actually recoup, or if not recoup, certainly change the way their leases and the way they are able to sell their properties going forward. And the landlords will have to certainly look at it. I don't really think this is, sort of individual landlords. These are institutional,
Mm.
larger
Yeah, they are.
operators, especially developers. And the only reason that the individuals actually end up owning them is because the developers turn around and say, well, actually, I don't want to manage this anymore. It's too much of a headache. I'm not making any money out of it. I haven't got enough staff, the resources. So I'll stick it in an auction or something like that. And somebody else will go, actually, I can do this sitting at home. So somebody else that takes it on. And that's what the smaller landlords sort of come into it. But yes, it's mostly new developers who actually sold blocks of flats. And majority of these are probably in the city of London, to be honest with you, as a large thing, because such levels of high developments were never happening outside of the cities of London or Manchester or Liverpool or Birmingham, because that wasn't the way it was. But 10, 15 years ago now, I suppose, when the government made changes about offices to convert into residential, which we talked about previously, other ideas, that's where smaller people came in and thought we can actually do this. And some of those leases may need to be looked at. So, yeah, let's look forward to see what the outcome of this bill is going to be.
I haven't seen many of those companies come forward and defend their practices, not surprisingly. But one last word we'll give to Guy, the expert on this. I've been amazed in the last 20 years since the common hold legislation was introduced that only a handful of common holds have been created, which is a real shame. Now, that's something we have discussed on the show before, isn't it? The common hold principle.
Yes, we covered that primarily because it is the way I think things will go in the future. And the leasehold has been sitting there primarily because historically that's what all they've really known, and majority of the people advise, and especially if it's just smaller blocks, they found it was easier. But Guy's right. I mean, it should be now used as a norm as opposed to something that occasionally gets done.
Mm. Um, and it should be reminded that there is an increased amount of freeholder obligation and ultimately the lessees need to pay. Increased amount of freeholder obligation. I wonder what his point is there. So increased amount of freeholder obligation and ultimately the lessees need to pay. Yeah, I suppose at the end of the day, they have signed an agreement. Perhaps this is the point he's making. They have signed an agreement,
so in the last
and they're going to have to pay something.
in the last 10, 15 years, all of the freeholders have put in so much demand about things that leaseholders need to pay for, and each time they want something done, like you said right at the outset, the consultation fees and so forth. But the demand has been huge on leaseholders from those freeholds, and part of those is what are causing these issues right now.
Mm. We'll leave that matter and return to it, no doubt, when we get through to the next reading of the bill in Parliament, but hopefully that will go through soon. I mean, common sense will prevail, hopefully, on that one. I can't see any reason why not. This was a really interesting piece that caught my eye this week, Joe. Ryan Bembridge, who's the editor of Property Investor Post, who's one of the sites that we look at for good content to discuss on the show, as you know. And he's just been talking about his experience of trying to actually become a tenant recently. And I can imagine that this is pretty common. So as a landlord looking for a tenant, what are the best ways to get a new tenant, and how should you behave as somebody who's looking to get a tenant? As a tenant searching for a new property in the last few months, I've discovered some strange behaviours that I wouldn't expect from any good landlord. says Ryan. Below, I'll round up some of my most recent experiences. So you'll have an idea of how not to behave when selecting a tenant. So the most serious example he had is as an Englishman renting in Canada after 2 years of living in the country, I was turned down to rent a property for having insufficient credit history in this country. So basically, he had a near perfect credit record in the UK, and because he'd been to live in Canada, came back, and then they basically turned him down because he didn't have a good track record of paying rent on time, even though prior to going he had paid rent for 8 years and never missed a payment, which seems absolutely crazy, doesn't it? He's got he had good regular income proof, sizable amount of savings, so he was secure, and he felt a victim of discrimination. Landlords should not reject a tenant when all evidence points to them becoming dependable, simply just because they have spent some time in another country. Right to rent checks aside, this seems pretty basic stuff. That's pretty damning, isn't it?
Yeah, so of recent times, I mean, going back again, I can only go back based on my own experiences, and that is that to rent a property was definitely not as complex as it has become now. And part of that complexity has been the self-doing of the tenants, in all honesty, because what happens is it's the old story here. So a handful of bad tenants create a problem for a lot of the good tenants. And so as time has gone on, the idea of renting and getting the information and so forth has become tougher and tougher and tougher, to a point where in the UK now it's very much based on the credit history, your file, and whether you are able to meet your commitment. And that causes a huge issue, not only for tenants going forward on rare rent, but also if anything adverse turns up that shows that they've not had a good credit history in terms of other credit issues. For example, even as stupid as a telephone or a mobile phone bill or something like that can actually create a problem for a tenant looking to rent. Now, obviously, as smaller things like that, most landlords will probably take that on board and go, it's kind of normal, everybody does it. But sometimes institutional and especially bigger landlords, and certainly the bigger asset properties, then take caution of those, because the problem they have then is that they've got a tenant in there that they've let in without the appropriate due diligence and checking out. And let's say they've taken a sort of a personal view, they then end up having a tenant that may become a sitting tenant because they actually can't afford to pay that. And the reason why this has happened is that as time has gone on, there's been a situation in someone's life, or in some cases, maybe not a situation in someone's life, but they've used it and abused that scenario and said, look, we've lost our job, or we are now going to have to make claims from the government as far as our credits are concerned, our benefits are concerned. And those are the people, unfortunately, the handful of people that then bugger it up for the good people, because somebody could be in a nice big house at a £3,000 a month rent, which they are allowed to get in without too many checks. And then once they're in, they turn around and say, well, I've now got a family of 10 kids or what have you, and what are you going to do with me? I'm not going to move, and I now need to, because I've lost my job, I now need to make this claim. And that becomes really messy and complex. And so it's those situations that lead to these scenarios, which is a totally unfair way of looking at it. But unfortunately, like I said, it's always a handful of people that make the problem for the larger majority. And then it's the case of a sledgehammer to crack a nut situation. So the policy becomes, as it is, that you go through the current situation. I mean, I've had a client recently who's come from abroad, very similar to this chap's story, lived here and so forth, and said, oh, I'm back in London, I need to get a place. And of course, the colleagues that I approached on that, they said, well, we have to do a credit check and we have to do this. And I said, well, when did all that come into it? And he said, well, unfortunately, all of our properties now have to have that. And if they don't do that and the landlord doesn't give us consent, on top of that, if we can't get insurance, so there comes the issue really, that if you are going to have protective insurance against rent, of somebody defaulting, the insurance company are not providing the appropriate cover, which gives the landlord that sort of concern to say, well, if the insurance company are not going to give me cover, do I question the fact that this is the right and adequate tenant for my property? And so the snowball effect starts to happen, and that's why such things as credit have become an issue, and I often are advising to clients that, even before they go out and rent, they must go and check that they are good for their own credit, and so they can do that by going online and doing an Experian credit check and make sure that they can deal with the questions that are likely to be raised.
Guys come back and said it's true. There is no communication between companies like Equifax and other countries across borders, in other words. And he's had personal experience of that. What's interesting, even more concerning from this experience of Ryan's, is that he said, I argue that renting property, it's definitely more beneficial to be female. He said, when searching for properties, listing after listing advertises properties as female only. And many that don't say so ignore any male applicants and never get in touch. So for me, it's unfair to tarnish everyone with the same brush. Not all women are good tenants, and it should depend on the individual rather than the gender regarding finding housemates that work together. One property was renting 2 rooms, he says. A woman was chosen for 1 room, but she said that she refused to live with another man, so he was turned down on the basis that they got her in the other room. Which is extraordinary. He seems to have had a very, very poor time of it, old Ryan, bless him. But I can imagine that, there's laws in place about this sort of thing for employment, isn't there? When you're employing staff, you can't choose based on gender or race or colour or any of that kind of thing, and quite rightly so. But here, there doesn't seem to be any fairness, does there?
I think there should be, and there is a certain amount of lawness that exists in choosing. It's like saying to someone, I don't want to rent to that person, or I don't want to sell to that person. I mean, now that question has been raised to me many times, and I've had to sort of turn around and say that is not a decision for us to make. We can't be seen to be saying, our client is saying that, you got to be pink, purple, or yellow, or a different nationality, or whatever, and so forth. All we can do is present them to you, and it's entirely up to you to reject them. But if you're rejecting them, they need to be rejected on reasonable grounds, because the likelihood of them coming back, and of course it's always the messenger that gets shot in these situations, Paul. So the person that's going to get shot is always going to be the agent or the representative, and they're going to say, well, you actually maybe presented me in a bad light because you didn't like me, and therefore it's you that is actually discriminative, which is not the case, because at the end of the day, we are all in this to run our business and make our financial income out of it. And there's no reason for us to think, why shouldn't be this, that, or the other type of person. But because you're the messenger, because you're the person that's actually delivering a message and saying, I'm sorry, but my client, i.e. my landlord, has said I can't rent this to you because of this, or because, like this, in this case, the female person says, I don't want another bloke in there, and therefore they can't do that. Those are all things that you've got to be very, very careful in how you actually present that, because that is probably in the first minute going to come and bite the person that's actually delivering the message on the backside, before it even gets to the landlord, because then it's the case of, because the landlord could very easily turn around and say, well, actually, no, I didn't say that. So everything has become very, very difficult, should I say, in order to make sure that you cover your own back. And I think there are scenarios that exist there, but each country and each step will have their own views on this. And like Guy said, there's no crossover. I mean, you should be able to say, you should be able to turn around and say, look, I've been living in Canada, and here's the history for me in Canada. I've had no problems there, and switch over. But because there is no communication, no system that talks to it, unfortunately, he's stuck out in the cold in that one.
The last point he makes on this, which I can hear all the landlords shouting, well, it's my property, I'll do as I like, thank you very much. I'm sure there are those that feel that way, and you can understand that to some extent. But he says that there was a number of landlords that implied during his search that they would enter the property without notice to ensure that everything is all and well. And while it's sensible for landlords to be confident of tenants' behaviour, privacy isn't an unfair expectation. You don't need to monitor the property at all times to see who comes and goes and when your tenant fancies ordering a takeaway. One landlord comically said, he likes his tenants to be loners, adding that if you can't really have anybody around other than maybe a girlfriend. But he concludes by saying it's a pretty sad world if the only people that are allowed to rent property are antisocial people.
Yeah,
But
well,
it does
there we
seem
have it.
that I haven't rented a property for decades, but it does seem that it's a much more tough. But then again, I suppose if you think about it, there's many more sort of personal small landlords who just have the odd property or maybe one property, and they're not running it. It's an addition to their income from another role, shall we say, and they're not necessarily experienced in doing this job.
And the other thing you have to bear in mind, Paul, in this is that our world has changed in more ways than one you can imagine. So there are historical landlords who have historical views. For example, you would be working in a type of institution that will provide you certain things. And there are scenarios where people are working from home, and they work for companies that are abroad, and they're working in a completely, and it's very difficult to put a trace on saying to somebody, what do you do for a living? Well, I don't work for Lloyd's Bank, or I don't work. Well, I do actually, but I work for their branch in Abu Dhabi, but I work from home. And all of a sudden, it's all of those scenarios, those different scenarios that then makes them think, well, are you really working for that? How do you do that? It is now not the norm that you would go to a ordinary job in the high street somewhere or in an office, because all of that has changed. And so our whole behavior is having to change. And as landlords find that difficult to perhaps adjust to, they are looking for what I think is, just someone who has a ordinary job, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, does this, does that, and this is the kind of person I want. But unfortunately, lesser and lesser of those are existing, because we know over the last couple of years alone how that has changed, let alone in the bigger picture where people are sitting at home with the right connection of internet, of course, and the quality, and working working from home, covering parts of the world.
Last story today, we're going to put our finger in the air and predict the future, as we try to do occasionally. Gronya's back from Zoopla. Gronya Gilmore, who does the monthly report. The reason for this really is we've kind of touched on this plenty of times, but there's an interesting view of the last few years that Gronya puts across. So she's predicting that the house price growth next year will be 3%. However, if you're nationwide, they're predicting that it's going to be 5%, so probably somewhere in between the two maybe. But just over 2 years ago, she says, in the summer of 2019, annual house price growth was at 1.3%, which is the lowest growth since 2013. And we were still recovering from a global financial crisis in those days. And this low rate, of course, was caused by uncertainty around Brexit, and that definitely put a brake on prices and activity in the market. But then there was the election in July 2019, a turning point with a new leader with a sizable majority, of course, and that meant that the housing market reacted immediately, growth of around 2% by the end of that year, and the first time that it reached that level in 12 months. And then, of course, we got a pandemic and the first lockdown, and there were fears of that the market would die. And, of course, obviously, we now know what happened as a result of that with the stamp duty holiday and lower rates, etc., on mortgages, etc. And, of course, we've got a house price growth now at 6.9%. But the chart that I want to share is this one here, which shows the growth. So that's January 11 at the left-hand side, growth at just over 1% there. And then peaking around May 2014 and then there you can see 2019 through May 2020 and the pandemic there. So really, all that's happened, Joe, in the last year is that prices have pretty much, or the rate of growth has grown to what it was, just a little bit less than May 2014, probably around May 2016. So we've been here before with these kind of figures, haven't we? And you can see where growth fell down, and obviously now you can see at the end there the impact of what the government did. But lastly, you can see that, of course, in September, October, and into November, we can see that the prices are beginning to ease off as the frenetic activity of the stamp duty holiday came to an end.
And it's a cycle, Paul. I mean, if you go back pretty much every 10 years, 12 years, with the exception of 2007 financial crash to the first rise or even the glimmer of hope of the housing market in 2014, 2015 was probably the best reactive year from 2007, 2008. I mean, that's not looking at the statistics. These are personal experiences and based on the way the businesses happen and the way people were moving. So literally for almost 7 years, there was hardly any movement in the property market. And those were all the uncertainties globally, nationally, and of course internationally, that made people sort of just say, I'll stay put. That didn't result in house prices going crashing down, and it didn't go in house prices going crazy going up. They just stayed because nobody was actually physically moving unless they just had to move and they was forced. So the number of unit and transactions was so low in those 7 8 years that it wasn't worth even almost being in the business to a large extent because nobody was actually shifting. So 2014, 2015 was probably the best years. And then 2016, obviously, with the view of the Brexit scenario, started to hold back a little bit. And then it came back when Boris had his landslide win. And then he came in and started to say that he wanted to have a generation of buyers, homeowners, as opposed to generation of renters, and subsequently utilize that tool. And I've said to you many times in our discussions that successive governments have used the housing market as their whore, I suppose, if you want to call it that, and says that I could turn around and make the housing market do this because that's what I need them to do that for, and that's what they've done really. I mean, pandemic came along, and that then sort of thought, well, hang on, what are people going to do? Shops were closing, people weren't allowed to be out on the streets. What did they do? They made stamp duty holidays and made people sitting at home watching it on their smartphones and saying, you know what, I need to move. I want to move out of this area because there's so much virus going around. I want to live in the country. I want to do this. I want to do that. They created this whole new story which allowed people and the housing market and the related businesses to the housing market to flourish. And that's what got us through. And that's what's getting us through. But now, of course, we will see the downturn. I do believe that there is a slowness in the market. There is a shortage of property. And I know that there are some people saying that stock shortage means that we're going to have to push the prices up and subsequently figures will do. But watch this space. Come end of January, the Bank of England will put their rate up. And that will be the stopping point. That will be the reason why, whether it's 2% or 4%, I don't think it will matter. It will matter because the government will use this as their little tool to slow down what they actually put up in the first place. And so people will start to say, well, actually, and they were going to do that before. But why didn't they do that, Paul? I'll tell you why they didn't do that. Because they knew that with Christmas coming on, they just did not want people to not spend in the high street. Even now, with so much going out in there, what are they saying? They're saying Christmas is still going on, which we know the way it's going, Christmas is probably not going to go on at the last minute. As soon as the kids break up from their schools come the 16th, 17th, 18th of December, the whole thing will start to tumble down, and then we'll be all on a mini lockdown, and then coming out of it, we'll have an interest rate hike, And so for next year, 2022, it's going to be a pretty challenging year in many ways. And most people will be just saying, if I can stand still and carry on there, I'll be okay. And that's what will probably happen to a large extent within the housing market. So I think there will be a little turn because obviously shortage of stock, but I don't think it's going to be at the levels that we've enjoyed over the last couple of years.
Mm. It's interesting actually because this 2021, 1 in 16 homes changed hands, so that's a fundamental change in the way people want to live, and a record figure. She suggests that there'll probably be two quarter point rate interest rises in the year. But that's still going to leave rates, historically very low when you compare it to previous years, for example. She says that things will improve because generally listings are 50% higher in January than they are in December because obviously everybody's stopping for Christmas. And there'll be an improvement in the number of homes being listed in January. And that's going to help the market to, normalise prices to some extent. But yeah, she reckons a couple of quarter point rate interest rises next year. So that'll put some brakes on, a little bit of headwind, I guess. But yes, it's a little bit more of a positive story from Rightmove. They suggesting 5%. Interesting where they get their figures from, Joe. Perhaps it's the crystal ball.
I think, obviously, well, Rightmove and Zoopla have a lot of data from across the board, but on the ground, the reality is, I can only tell you from, not using your graphs or their crystal ball. I'm just using the Joe Joshi crystal ball, and that just says to you that basically there will be a little rise in the interest rates that will put a little bit of a break. Not because we're at all-time low rates, Paul. It's just a psychological thing. All of a sudden, if something, let's say you've got a varying mortgage and you're paying £500 a month, and that then becomes £550, that 50 quid starts to sort of think, well, hang on now, is this the beginning of the end? Is it going to go any higher? And maybe another 0.25%, and then you're set to 600. All of a sudden, £100 a month is starting to go out. So it's up in your mind that starts to say, well, actually, I need to maybe rethink about what I'm doing. And that is what makes people sort of put the brakes on generally, not because they are all-time low rates and therefore some. And yes, there'll be some that'll be, but will it stop first-time buyers? Will it stop investors? Will it stop people actually getting on the house? No, of course not, because that is what, that's the way we live. That's our system. That's the way we dream.
Well, Joe, our time is up. It's great to hear that you're on the mend still. Certainly, your voice sounds a lot better this week than it did last week, and indeed over the week before that. So that's great to see progress on a weekly basis, and it's great to hear your knowledge and wisdom each week, as always. And thank you for that. And thank you to Guy for his support and help over a particularly technical issue earlier. And thank you for watching Property Matters this week. We'll be back same time next week.